By way of disclosure, Hugh and I have been colleagues for the best part of 40 years, and this is not the first time we've met. We know each other's work and our writings really very well, and we've always got much to discuss, and we're hoping that tonight we'll just show you how much there is to discuss. This is a fantastic essay. I would recommend it to all you. It's incredibly accessible. There are lots and lots of things in it that are shocking, and properly so. They force you to think. And we're going to touch on a few of those, and one or two which are implicitly there but not written in large letters. And before we start, I will also acknowledge that in the audience tonight there are a number of our former colleagues, Hugh.
I noticed that.
And they're the scariest bastards of the lot because they really know what we're like. And we'll probably be beaten up as we get outside the door there. But we're going to brave that, and we'll, I think, if you don't mind, we'll start now. I will bring it to a close about 5 minutes earlier than usual because there are so many people here that there may well be lots and lots of questions, and it's your chance too to register your points. Well, Hugh, in this really wonderful book, you start off by frightening us. And you tell us that we shouldn't lose our sense of bewilderment and dismay. There are limits to bewilderment and dismay, however, and I'm wondering where those limits actually are. Public protest sometimes limits bewilderment and dismay. You get out there and scream about it. And you can go on from that to demonstrations, insurrection, revolution, and even, as we've been hearing around the United States for a couple of years now, the potential for a different kind of civil war. And I'm just wondering, Hugh, if sitting in the back of your mind as you began broaching this subject is America as perhaps the precipitator of the massive global uncertainty in which we find ourselves now, is itself heading towards a solution to its own bewilderment and dismay?
Well, that's a great way to start, Allan, but let me first say what a pleasure it is to share the platform with you, and thank you for engaging in this conversation, and thanks to Colin, of course, for making all of this happen, bring us all here, and for you all for coming. Look, the point I was making in that reference early in the essay was that it does seem to me that one of the problems we face in understanding what's happening to us at the moment is that just through sheer repetition and exposure, the Trump phenomenon becomes normalised. And it does seem to me very important that we keep on refreshing our sense that this is absolutely astonishing, that this man with this character should have not once but twice ascended to the presidency of the United States, and that it is no longer, of course, remotely sensible to call it an anomaly, because it's a clear and very well-established trend, but it is nonetheless a complete discontinuity with the way America works, and that has very big implications for America itself. And I think that's quite an interesting subject, but we're not Americans. It has huge implications for the way America works in the world, and it has huge implications, therefore, for Australia, because America's role in the world is so important to the way Australia conceives its place in the world and how we make our way in it. So I think I was just trying to kind of refresh people's sense of bewilderment. Now, the question as to why it's happened, well, a lot of ink has been spilt by people who know a lot more about American politics than I do. But it does seem to me to be really important to register that although Trump is obviously himself a person of extraordinary talents, I mean, he must be, by definition, to have taken over the American political system from such a, what looks like unsatisfactory, implausible basis of experience and character and skills and so on. There's something else is obviously going on, and that is, I think, very deep, obviously structural weaknesses in the US political system, which I didn't see one obvious thing, of course, is the weakness of the Republican Party, the fact that this mighty party, which had had such a huge role in shaping American life and therefore the world for so long, found itself taken over by this bloke and seemingly incapable of resisting him. And the Democratic Party, another great political party, seemed to be completely incapable of finding an effective response to him. And then, of course, there's the fact that the bureaucracy doesn't seem to be able to respond, the courts don't seem to be able to respond, the media doesn't know how to respond. So the key elements of the American political settlement do seem to have come astray. And just reminding ourselves that this is really big and really significant and not transitory is important, because I think in Australia, but not just in Australia, in Europe and elsewhere, there's a bit of a tendency to think, and you could see this actually in the way people were talking about how poor Mr. Albanese might have handled his conversation with Donald Trump had it happened, that you can somehow just manage your way through this. You can just pretend that you can have a normal head of state to head of government conversation as if, you know, Donald Trump was just a different kind of Barack Obama or George Bush or Bill Clinton. No, he's not like that.
One of the things that Hugh and I spent a fair bit of our time when we weren't working at the Department of Defence, which was a lot of the time, was the relationship between cause and consequence, because that is ill understood, I think, by many people, and most of all, ill understood by politicians. They reverse them, generally speaking, which makes their speeches so attractive to listen to. I attended the Australian Defence Conference yesterday and listened to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence, and I can't tell you what he said. I didn't understand it. The reason I mention it, cause and consequence, though, is that Nick Bryant and a lot of the people in this audience will have been at Nick's presentations here and have listened to Nick. In his book, The Forever War, he would, I think, argue that Trump is actually a product of the American system. So he's a consequence of the American system, while simultaneously he is a cause of a very fundamental readjustment of that system, Hugh. And you've just sort of touched upon the consequential parts of it, but the causation factors, I think, need a little bit more explanation and exploration. So, you know, is Trump sort of an anomaly? Is he a product of the system? Is he both of those things? Is he representing a world in which contradictions don't exist anymore?
Look, I think he's a massive discontinuity. But that doesn't, I think, make him an anomaly. I mean, he is caused, obviously, and I think part of the cause is that weakness of the American political system, of the unseen, at least by me, but now very evident weakness of the American political system. But it is something a bit deeper than that, because in the end, the guy's been voted in, and not just voted in once. There's a wonderful a map that the New York Times has printed, which shows those US counties, and the county is the level at which our votes are counted, a bit like our booths. There are 3,800 or something counties in the United States. Over half of them, Trump's vote has increased every time. From the 2012 vote before he was there to 2016 to 2020 to 2024. The little map which shows with red arrows of varying lengths how far the vote for Trump keeps growing is a sea of red. So it's not just the weakness of the political parties. There is something about, I mean, I think as I say in the essay, the more Americans see of Trump, the more they like him. So that tells you something about not just the weakness of the US political system, but something about what's been going on in America. I don't pretend to make a judgment about what that is. I do think the stagnation of US average family incomes over many, many decades must be a very big part of it, and that, of course, does have something to do with the collapse of manufacturing, and that has something to do with globalisation, but I think to blame it all on the Chinese, so to speak, is a big oversimplification. I think another factor and this plays into issues that we may touch on again, is that the United States has had, I think, a very difficult period in which it has, since the end of the Cold War, and particularly since the end of the beginning of the century, in which it has identified for itself a global leadership role which it has in fact found itself incapable of exercising, and at tragic cost in some cases. So I do think that strategic political component is important alongside the economic component. Whether a deeper, so to speak, questions of the US national spirit or character, that's above my pay grade, I don't know.
Not sure it is, Hugh. I'm not going to let you off easily on that. You may not be an advocate of Morgenthau, Hugh, but you certainly understand him pretty well. And of course, moral suasion and the moral force of a country is one of the elements of national power, according to Morgenthau. And you see fights in the United States in the major newspapers virtually every day of the week, revolving around precisely that problem. You've got people whom you and I both know very well who continue to believe that the United States is indispensable, and yet you have a president who presently thinks that it's not. And so he thinks that the price of American leadership is not worth the cost. And that is a really serious problem for the United States, because until it works out a cost-price relationship with respect to its own power, it cannot resolve itself. And that, I think, is where you do need, or we both need, to just talk a little bit more about where Trump is in that panoply of forces in the United States.
Yeah, no, that really gets to the heart of the issue, because a big part of the argument I'm making in the essay is that, if I can put it this way, what we all think is happening about American withdrawal from leadership is happening, but it's not happening for the reasons that we all think it is. It's very easy, because Trump is so spectacular in some ways, and I think genuinely very significant, it's easy to think that the collapse in US global leadership, the problems with the Ukraine, problems with the Middle East, that this is Trump's doing. And I do think it's much bigger than that. And the reason, what I try to do in the essay is produce an argument that shows that the forces that are driving America away from the model of global leadership that it adopted at the end of the Cold War, and that we all, well, most of us, but certainly I, welcomed the idea of a unipolar US-led order, because whatever its faults, I'd rather America was the world's leading power than any of the other options. That model, the rationale that underpinned that model for the United States has collapsed. And it's not just the collapse of the post-Cold War model, but indeed the collapse of the whole model of American engagement globally, which characterised so much of the 20th century, and particularly the 20th century after the 7th or 8th of December 1941, depending on which side of the international date line you were that morning. So the underlying argument I make there is that America, throughout the 19th century, pursued very successfully a policy of isolationism, that is, of limiting, some isolationism. They took a whole hemisphere and said, this one's ours, and we're not going to pay any attention to what happens elsewhere. But that did work very well for the United States, not being engaged in the strategic affairs of the Eurasian landmass writ large, from Europe all the way to Asia and down. And that worked for the United States because throughout the 19th century there was a balance of power in Eurasia, because the European powers were the only ones that really counted, and there was a balance of power in Europe, and so no single power could end up dominating the whole of Eurasia, and if no power could dominate the whole of Eurasia, then no power could threaten or challenge the United States, guarded as it was by what Donald Trump keeps calling those big, beautiful oceans. And he's right, they are very strategically significant. Now, what happened in the 20th century was that the balance of power broke down within Europe and across Eurasia with the rise of Germany first and then of Russia, the Soviet Union. And the history of the long 20th century was the history of that unfolding. Now the United States seems to me to be back in a position where the balance of power in Eurasia writ large has been restored, because there's Europe, Russia, China, India, and some other significant powers, Japan, of course, Indonesia eventually. And so we're back in a world in which, because Eurasia has got a lot of very complex powers in it who will all balance one another, the United States no longer has to fear what happens in Eurasia and therefore can safely withdraw to the old Western Hemisphere. So that's why Trump is a very strong Monroe Doctrine man. That's, ask the Canadians, ask the Greenlanders, ask the Panamanians. He's very strong on dominating his backyard, but he doesn't care so much about what happens in Eurasia. So when he says of Putin, and said to Zelensky, I don't care much about what happens in Ukraine, that's what he meant. When he takes a much more relaxed approach, as I think he does, I'm sure he does, towards China's aims to take America's place as a leading power in East Asia, that's what's going on. So, and my argument is that even if Trump hadn't been elected, even if we look back over the Obama era, Trump's first term, and the Biden era, we can see an America which is failing to do what's necessary to preserve its leadership globally against the challenges that it faces from Russia and China in particular, because in the end, the imperatives to do so are not balanced by the costs and risks involved in doing it. And if you can't, in the long term, justify what you have to do in terms of the imperatives to do it, then in the long term, you're not going to do it. That's what we're seeing.
Hugh, the balance of power, as we saw it in Europe in the 19th century, was in a reasonably confined landmass. When we start talking about balance of power in Eurasia, we're talking about a huge landmass, in fact, maybe several different landmasses, some huge powers, some huge forces at work, most of which we, Australians and many of us in this audience, really don't understand at all because we don't study those things. Helen might tell us about that. But that's a different issue. But I do want to get to the point where you come to a very considered judgment about 1/3 of the way through the book, that one of the reasons that America can relax a bit is it no longer has to fear the emergence of a Eurasian hegemon. Now, that is a very bold statement. I think made even more bold by the fact that you and I both know that we have many critics who challenge our particular position on China. But the question is it far too early to write China off as the Eurasian hegemon?
Well, you're right. It's a very central judgment in the whole essay and my whole approach to this, and it's a judgment that strikes a contrast with what is a very widely held view. I won't say in the United States, but in Washington DC, amongst what you might call the foreign and strategic policy elites, and pretty widely held amongst their counterparts here in Canberra. Not entirely a coincidence, that one. And that is that China is setting out to rule the world and has the power to do so. In other words, that China has the capacity to do what we thought, and some of us hoped, the United States would do at the end of the Cold War. Or to put it another way, China has the capacity to do what we all feared the Soviet Union might do during the Cold War. Now, what strikes me about a single country establishing global hegemony is that it's incredibly bloody hard. I mean, in the end, no one's ever succeeded in doing it. The United States came closest after the Cold War, but even there, it only looked like it was succeeding in the 1990s because the Russians were exhausted and the Chinese were crafty. The Russians, having seen the Soviet Union collapsed, did have a decade off, and then they came back with Putin. And the Chinese, Deng Xiaoping's famous injunction, hide your power, don't claim leadership, sneak up on the bastards. That's a rather loose translation. But there was an era in which it appeared that the world's other great powers were not going to contest American leadership, and therefore America could be the dominant power. But it only made sense as long as, people assumed that America had a measureless and unchallengeable preponderance in every dimension of national power, as people believed in the 90s, and that other great powers wouldn't challenge them, as people believed in the 90s. Now, both of those are proved to be false. America faces in China, and I might say eventually in India, are countries with comparable scales of economic weight, and certainly in the case of China, with comparable mastery of cutting-edge technologies. And that, that makes a huge difference. It faces in Russia a country which is much weaker in many dimensions, but has one dimension of power which we are now being reminded, thanks to the sufferings of Ukraine, is really critical and is often a game changer, and that is it has an awful lot of nuclear weapons. And one of the arguments I'm making in the essays is you really do have to look very carefully at the way nuclear weapons shape global politics. In the era since the end of the Cold War, we've all sort of allowed ourselves to forget a bit about nuclear weapons. Those of us who lived through the Cold War breathed a big sigh of relief. But of course the numbers reduced, but not much. And they haven't gone away. And nuclear weapons, we are now reminded again, and I think particularly in Ukraine, are an incredibly significant factor in this. So what America has discovered is that the challenge of maintaining global hegemony is much, much higher than they thought, and therefore that's why I think they're stepping away from it. And when I look at China, I say, well, why is China going to be any different? So, and particularly because in Eurasia, it does face very formidable potential rivals. I think it's very hard for China to intrude substantially in what you might call India's natural sphere of influence in South Asia and the Indian Ocean. It's very hard for China to build on the without limits partnership without limits with Russia, to actually try and subdue Russia and make Russia a vassal state. That's not the Russia I know. And Russia, I think, remains easily strong enough to resist that. And there is still Europe to deal with. Now, Europe is a bit of a problematic case because it is, if you like, I think, a great power coming into being. It's, if I can risk a etymological analogy that might go wrong, it's a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. It's only halfway through the transition, but I do think, thanks to Donald Trump on the one hand and Vladimir Putin on the other, Europe is emerging as a genuine, unified strategic player in its own right. Well, put it this way, it doesn't have much choice. If it doesn't do that, then it's going to be in real trouble, and I have a feeling the Europeans are getting it. So all of that makes me, not certain. We're not in the certainty business here, but when I look at China's predicament, and I'm bullish on China, I think it's going to be the most powerful single country in the world, but it's going to be a very powerful country in a world which have a lot of centres of power. This is, in other words, it's a multipolar order. And I think that multipolarity is baked into something which is very fundamental to the way the world works, and that is the distribution of wealth and power and nuclear weapons. And so I think I'm not certain, but I'm pretty bloody sure.
Let's just see how sure you are. I love you.
Always happy to await the judgment of history.
Yes, well, I hope you enjoy the wait. I love your poetry, Hugh, the caterpillar turning into a butterfly. Europe could just as equally be a maggot turning into a blowfly. And you've got to...
that, not me.
You may use the expression, Hugh, because, Europe itself is pretty divided at the moment. It's poor, it's lacking certainty, it's lacking direction, and it's very hard to see until it finds a new United States how it's going to recast itself as a more or less united group. I want to come back, though, to China and the concept of power. You see, in your long essay, your concept of power generally focuses around military force, military power, the ability to destroy, or at least the ability to threaten to destroy. And we will follow this line a little further in a moment. But just for now, I would like you, Hugh, to consider the nature of power and how it's worked for a long time in Asia. Military power hasn't been the dominant force in the way in which Asia has conducted its affairs for at least 2,000 years. Military force does come into it, and there are Orientalists in the room here who will be able to give you really good stories about how force operated in places like Thailand and Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos and so on, Myanmar. But essentially, China's power has been a deeply cultural one. It's been, anybody who has been around in Hanoi would have gone to the Park of the Philosophers perhaps, and seen that one of the great icons of Chinese power are the big tortoises standing around in that park, each bearing the name of a Vietnamese person who passed the Mandarin entrance examinations in Beijing. I mean, that is real power. It's, Hugh, you're an Oxford graduate, you know exactly what we're talking about here. The need for affirmation elsewhere. And that is serious power. And I'm wondering the extent to which you would like to moderate a bit your sense of this hegemony, which is not necessarily driven by military power, but driven by a concomitance of all different sorts of power, economic, political, social, the unifying force of China itself, which India hasn't got. There we are, you get the point.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, and it's one I've spent a fair bit of time pondering. So there's two issues to respond to here. The first is how we judge the way in which, if you'll forgive the shorthand, the strategic system in Asia operates. And Alan, you're absolutely right that if we look back through the centuries, there is a potential, big mistake to be made by presupposing that Asia works the same way Europe does. And what I've done, of course, in this analysis is to presuppose that that Asia is going to work pretty much the way Europe has worked as a strategic system, and I'm applying lessons learned from the European strategic history to what's happening in Asia. And the question is, well, is that valid? The reason I think it probably is because one of the things that has happened in the last couple of centuries is that Asia has moved, partly because of the impact of colonialism, but not just because of that, but has become a system of nation states, which look a lot like the nation states of Europe, whereas the Asia of the sort of pre-European era, of the tributary states era, was a very different kind of international system involving very different kinds of entities. Now, one of the things that strike me is that when you look at Asia as it became a system of nation states, it did start to conduct itself in many ways, though not in every way, very like the way that the European system of states evolved. The big exception, I might say, is ASEAN. Europe has no example of a group of states like ASEAN, very diverse states, quite different histories in many cases, that have found a way to work together towards joint ends as well as ASEAN has. So I just note that as a sort of counterexample to my argument. But elsewhere, if you look at the way things have worked out in Northeast Asia, for example, between Russia and China and Japan and the Koreas, if you look at what's happened in South Asia between India and Pakistan, for example, then I think in an imperfect discipline in which the conceptual tools are sparse, the history of Europe does seem to me to be the best methodology we have. And so far, I've got to say, it's working pretty well. I don't feel I've been misled by that. So what kind of power really counts? You're absolutely right. National power comes in lots of different forms. It can be exercised in lots of different ways, and it has several different sources. But one kind of power does come to the fore, or different kinds of power come to the fore in different kinds of conversations and interactions. And when the interaction is a contest between states concerning their position in the international system, who's a great power and who isn't, amongst the great powers, who's the dominant one, then what one does find pretty consistently through history is that those are the issues that states go to war over, that great powers go to war with one another over, and indeed they're just about the only issues that great powers go to war with one another over. Great powers go to war with small powers all the time. America invades Iraq and whatever. But great powers only go to war with other great powers because great power wars are so costly for very specific and very sort of trenchant set of reasons. And it's almost always about their respective roles and places in the international system. And now, that doesn't mean that war in these situations is inevitable, because that's not actually what Thucydides said. But it does mean that as the contest, because there are ways in which the war can be avoided, one side or both sides can back down. But it does mean that, from my observation of the history, these are contests which are determined by a contest of military power and resolve. That is, the country that can most convince the country that can convince the other guy that they are prepared to go to war to get their way, when the other guy is not prepared to go to war to get their way, is the country that'll win. And this plays out, as we're seeing right now, for example, over Taiwan. Whether or not the United States remains the leading power or even a significant strategic power in Asia is being tested by both sides over their respective willingness to go to war over Taiwan. And you might say the same is happening in Europe. Whether Russia is going to be accorded the status of a great power in Europe, or whether it's going to be compelled to sit back and become some kind of middle power, is being sorted out by whether or not other countries are willing to go to war to support Ukraine against Russia. And we've learnt the answer, by the way. They're not. Russia's winning. It is a great power. That particular chapter is over. There's still plenty in the story to run, but the decisive resolution of the question, is Russia a great power anymore? Yes, it is.
No, of course it is. I want to, Hugh, first of all, congratulate you for mentioning Graham Allison in your book without mentioning Thucydides. That's a very difficult thing to do, and congratulations. I admire it enormously. It took me a little while, about 15 years ago, to retranslate Thucydides for Graham Allison, and he's never acknowledged my email. See, there are disappointments for people who work in the Department of Defence, I can tell you that. Hugh, I want to go a little bit further to some really creative wordsmithing that is right bang in the middle of your essay.
I'm not sure that's a compliment.
Oh, yes, it is, because we can talk about the second limb of your wonderful wordsmithing, the balance of resolve. Right. Because it is new language, I think, Hugh. I haven't discovered that very widely. We're good at making up good new language, but resolve is a wonderful word to put in there, because you chose resolve instead of any number of other words. Conviction, for example, might have been another word you could have used. And I'm wondering whether the wormhole that might exist in your argument is around the nature of resolve itself. Who has got the resolve as a great power to take the ultimate step of annihilating another great power? And that kind of resolve, that is, to annihilate or the resolution to be annihilated, goes, I think, to the heart of the conundrum which I don't think you've answered, and which very few of us in the room, I think, are yet able to answer, because it depends ultimately on that fundamental insight of Thucydides. It's human choice that takes you into that space.
Yeah, no, it is certainly a question of choice. Let me come at that a little bit sideways. The reason I use that phrase, the balance of resolve, is because it does seem to me very, very important when you have two competing powers who have a roughly equal capacity to impose costs and risks on one another. And that is the world in which, for example, each side has substantial numbers of nuclear weapons capable of targeting one another's cities. Then which of them wins a contest depends in the end on which of them cares more. Now, this is nuclear strategy, so it gets a bit baroque. But this could take longer than we really have. But if you
No, it won't, Hugh.
If you imagine a war over Taiwan, which goes for a few, remember it's the biggest war since the Second World War. It goes for a few weeks, and both sides have shot off all their missiles, have lost most of their ships, have had most of their bases in the theatre attacked, and they've both really fought themselves to a standstill. So they both face the recognition that the only way they can keep fighting this war is to cross the nuclear threshold. And they both look at the other, and one of them, and they each have to say, if I can persuade the other side that I'm willing to use nuclear weapons, and that if they use nuclear weapons, I'll retaliate against them. In other words, if one side can convince the other they're more likely to use their nuclear weapons, then they'll be the side who wins the game of bluff. And neither side needs to use nuclear weapons, but they have to have a competition as they're sort of measuring their relative resolve, and the balance, the country that has the balance of resolve in its favour will end up winning the game of bluff. Now, I do think that is very likely to be the situation we face. And what's at stake there is what drives the resolve, what creates the resolve, is the sense of how great is the imperative. Now, if you imagine the situation, for example, over Berlin in 1961, most people when thinking about this think of a Cuban Missile Crisis, but it's not quite the right analogy because Cuba is in the Western Hemisphere. Berlin isn't. In 1961, in the middle of 1961, the Russians, the Soviets and the Americans were face to face over Berlin. Slightly more complicated than this, but roughly speaking, the Soviets wanted to take over West Berlin, and Kennedy went on national television and said in words of one syllable, "We will defend West Berlin if necessary by fighting a nuclear war, and we recognise that nuclear war will involve attacks on American cities." He told Americans that. Now, that had a huge impact in Moscow. In the Kremlin thought, okay, well, we want to get, all sorts of reasons they wanted to take West Berlin, but they didn't want it enough. And Kennedy convinced the Soviets that he had the resolve to fight a nuclear war, including suffering attacks on US cities, in order to stop the Soviets. Now, of course, the same would have applied the other way round. If Kennedy had decided he wanted to take East Berlin, the Soviets would have showed equal resolve. In fact, what kept the Cold War cold and made the Cold War so distinctive was that the balance of resolve was even. What's different today in Ukraine and what's different today in Taiwan is the balance of resolve is not even. In the end, it's clear that China cares more about Taiwan than the United States. In the end, it's clear that Russia cares more about Ukraine than the United States or the Europeans do. And that's what's determining the outcome. That's why the balance of resolve seems to me to be really central.
We're going to go just one step further on that, and then we're going to change direction for a little while. We're going to go into nuclear weapons to have a little chat about them. But just while we're on the balance of resolve, Hugh, a lot has happened, though, since there was a standoff in Berlin or the Cuban crisis. That was run 2 generations ago. We've had 2 subsequent generations where, at least in the Western Hemisphere, there's, I think, a much lower tolerance of pain. The American people are a bit sick of going to war all the time. You walk past the American War Memorial, the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington. You see that sort of 48,000 dead Americans for no good purpose, the Iraq War and so on. That the balance, I think, of resolve is tempered a lot by the balance of pain threshold. And it is the case, I think, that other great powers have yet retained a much higher pain threshold than others. I worked very briefly, for a year actually, for Sir James Plimsoll, a name that would be known to many of you here, fabulous man, and he told me once that when Mao Zedong went to visit Nehru in 1954, they had a nice conversation, and Mao Zedong said to Nehru, and this, remember, is 54, Were China ever to find itself at war, it could dedicate 100 million dead. That's a pretty strong statement. And that was India without nuclear weapons, and China might have just got them at Lopnor. I make the point, though, Hugh, because the tolerance to pain is where you start to blink, and where the deterrence aspects of it actually falls over.
Look, I don't dismiss the argument. I think it could easily be that America's tolerance for pain has reduced, but I don't think that's the key factor here. I think the key factor is rather the imperative for the United States has reduced. It doesn't make as much sense to tolerate pain for the United States today as it did, or at least as they deeply believed it did in the Cold War, because they genuinely believed that the Soviet Union, if not contained, would dominate Eurasia and therefore be strong enough to threaten the United States. And the proposition that the Soviet Union could dominate Eurasia, if you think of the Eurasia and the Soviet Union of the early 1950s, the Soviet Union was surrounded by a Europe that had been, it dominated Eastern Europe, of course, it was there. It was faced a Western Europe that was flat on its back after the Second World War and had some very strong domestic communist movements. It faced an India that was just post-colonial and was still finding its feet and had a very strong indigenous communist movement. You had a China which was actually a Soviet ally. You had a Japan which was still flat on its back and had a very strong indigenous communist movement, and you had Southeast Asia in pieces all over the workshop floor. So it was perfectly credible in the early 50s, from the late 40s, when the Americans committed themselves to the Cold War, that the Soviet Union could have dominated the whole of Eurasia and therefore could have posed that kind of threat to the United States. Now, it was in the light of that that America was prepared to spend the extraordinary sums of money. I mean, 10% of GDP throughout the 50s, 8% of GDP throughout the 60s, still 7 and 6% of GDP in the 70s and 80s. I mean, this was a real deal. And, I mean, to me, the story about Vietnam is that the Americans were prepared to keep on fighting until they lost 50,000, until they lost all those names on those remarkable walls in Washington. So I don't underestimate America's resolve where its vital interests require it. But what is different today is that China, though it's actually stronger relative to the United States than the Soviet Union ever was, far stronger relative to the United States than the Soviet Union ever was, it's weaker relative to its neighbours in Eurasia than the Soviet Union was at the height of the Cold War, and therefore the imperatives for the United States to contain it are much weaker because the United States can rely on China's neighbours in Eurasia to contain it for them. And that's a really critical difference. I think if the United States again faced a genuine hegemonic challenge on Eurasia, it would quite possibly prove as ruthless as it has in the past.
Well, Hugh, I had two different tracks to follow from there, and I'm very much aware of the time because the audience would like to have a say too. So I'm going to put one final proposition to you, and I had been thinking, and I'm cueing the audience here, whether there is such a thing as moral authority and moral suasion, and wouldn't it be lovely if leaders had a bit of that? But I'll just throw that out there and see what happens with debate. I want to get back to your agnosticism, Hugh. One wonders whether the developments over the last half decade or so have taken us into a world where the possession of nuclear weapons has become normalised. We talk about it all the time. Lavrov says, if you guys to the west there don't behave yourselves, I'll nuke you. Putin backs him up in it. China and the United States have both got renewed nuclear programs. India and Pakistan are staring each other strongly across a fence. And then we have people in Asia and in Europe seriously contemplating whether or not the best avenue for everybody is to have a nuclear weapon and to maintain a balance of resolve. Just how dangerous is that, Hugh? Do we have to revitalise the disarmament process and get back to thinking of the human race as something which is intrinsically valuable and needs to be protected by all of us?
Really important question. I do think the risks of a really catastrophic breakdown of the non-proliferation regime, which was one of the great achievements the latter part of the 20th century, is, that's a real deal. And I think it's, one of the temptations is to think that the establishment of the non-proliferation regime, in which a whole lot of countries around the world, including Australia, of course, who were, so to speak, on the track, either politically and psychologically or actually physically, to acquiring their own nuclear weapons, stepped back and said, no, we're not going to do that. And there's a bit of a tendency looking back at that moment in the late 60s, early 70s, and its maintenance over the decades since then, that it reflected a high moral judgment that, of the kind that you've just sketched. I'm a bit of a gloomy person, and one aspect of my gloom is that I do think that's a wrong interpretation of what drove that movement. There was a set of strategic circumstances which made it sensible for countries, including Australia, to step back from the idea of nuclear weapons. It does seem to me that those circumstances have changed, and so I think countries around the world, most obviously some European countries in Northeast Asia, and potentially somewhere down the track, Australia, will find themselves re-asking that question. And I think there are going to be some very pessimistic answers to be given. Now, I do think that is a very serious situation, because I really do think nuclear weapons are terrible things. But just because it's a terrible outcome doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And I think it's very important to look at those realities very coldly in the eye and start working out how you respond to it effectively.
We could take this conversation forever onward, couldn't we? But you're going to do that now. So if those who would like to put a proposition or ask you a question would come towards the microphone, Jack, which is right next to you there, nearly as tall as you are, Jack. And there's another one over here for those who would like to come from the side. Jack.
One of the things which has changed in relatively recent times is that the US is no longer dependent on Middle Eastern oil. Yes. I asked that thinking that the war with Japan 60 years ago, 70 years ago, was largely fought over resources. What do you think that Japan learnt out of the war, and what do you think its neighbours learnt out of war about testing their boundaries?
About testing America's boundaries?
Well, and their own. I mean, China observing, say, what happened to Japan.
Yeah. Really good question. I just make the point that the thing that really drove the United States to focus on oil out of the Middle East was not so much that, all the way going right back, was not so much that the United States depended on Middle East oil, but that its allies did. America, for most of the time actually, in the 20th century, remained the world's largest producer of oil and remained a net exporter of oil, but it was really critical for their allies in Europe and Japan, and that's really what made the Middle East oil, and of course their own companies were making a buck out of it. Look, I think if you, it is instructive to look at the Japanese experience when thinking about what's happening in Asia at the moment, because we do have, one data point for what happens when a rising Asian great power attempts to establish regional hegemony. And I think the really critical question, lesson that the Chinese would draw from Japan's experience is, don't overdo the territorial acquisition. I mean, it's always worth remembering that notwithstanding the remarkable achievement of America's, 4-year maritime campaign against Japan, which could have culminated in the amphibious assault on Japan itself, the Japanese empire was defeated in China by the Chinese it is something that's worth our while remembering, just like it's worth our while remembering that it was the Red Army that destroyed the Wehrmacht. And so people, they look at China's clear ambitions and they tend to see a country, and it's very easy to think, oh, they want to do what the Nazis and Imperial Japan did. They want to invade other countries and occupy them. In fact, that's a really dumb way of running an empire, inverted commas. The lesson to learn is to watch what America did. America has been the leading power in the Western Hemisphere since 1824, roughly speaking, the Monroe Doctrine, and give or take the occasional invasion, it's done that not by trying to occupy other people's territories, but actually by having quite a light touch and making sure that you only intervene in other people's affairs where it really matters to you. Now, Donald Trump seems to be violating that particular principle, even in relation to Canada. But I do think there's a lesson to be drawn from the Japanese experience, and I do have a sense that China draws it. Taiwan's a special case. But other than Taiwan, I don't see evidence that the Chinese, at least the present Chinese system, government, leadership culture, aspires to the kind of territorial aggrandisement that the Japanese aspired to in China.
Do I have any more questions from the audience? That is reassuring, Hugh, because I've got a lot more. Hugh, I will just put one proposition to you, Hugh, and it is related to the nuclear question, of course, and that is that, and I might just say my interaction with Sir James Plimsoll was in the Australian delegation to the Committee on Disarmament, so it was in that context that we had that conversation. Hugh, I think that the realist sort of concept of power over maybe the last 10 years has slid into a brutalist concept of power. In other words, it's been demoralised. It's been largely made Nietzschean, really. It's totally anaesthetic. It has no feeling for anything. And it just concentrates on what it might be to be the last person on earth. That's not a happy place to be. And I'm wondering, Hugh, whether you do have any thoughts at all about the need to reintroduce the moral quotient into the way in which we talk about our world, the affairs that we conduct in this world, international relations, or whatever one might like to call it.
Yeah, no, really important question. Because the way in which most people who think about such things would see me as a realist. It's not actually a label that I own up to, because realism, the sort of classic vision of realism, is of someone who looks at the interplay of power and so on and pays no attention to the moral judgments involved. And I do think there's merit, so to speak, in just analysing what's going on without asking who's the good guy and who are the bad guys. But that's not actually my kind of realism. I think of my kind of realism as an approach to international relations which pays very high attention, a lot of attention, to the actual costs involved in different courses of action. So you look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine and think that is terrible. And it is terrible. But the question you've got to ask yourself is, what does it cost to stop it? And if the cost of stopping it is a nuclear war, then you face a very ugly choice. Do you support Ukraine's absolutely just and legitimate aspirations to pursue its own national destiny as an independent state at the price of fighting a nuclear war? Likewise, in Taiwan, it's the easiest thing in the world to say that all the right on the Taiwan story is on the side of the Taiwanese. Here is a vibrant democracy, a very successful society. If it is subordinated to the will of the Chinese Communist Party, it will be a tragedy. So does that mean we should go to war to defend Taiwan? Well, what's on the other side of the ledger? The worst war since 1945, and very likely a nuclear war. Is it worth that? Now, it's the easiest thing in the world to make the choices between a good outcome and a bad outcome. But that's not the luxury we have. What we face is a whole series of choices between one really bad outcome and another really bad outcome. And we don't make, with a moral obligation to recognise that the costs on both sides of the ledger, and to make a very difficult judgment about which is greater. And they're often very uncomfortable decisions. That's why and I say this in the essay, I think Australia should declare that we wouldn't go to war with China over Taiwan, because I don't think, tragic though that would be, I don't think fighting a war that we would not win, that would probably devastate Taiwan, and that would carry immense costs, is worth it. It's a very hard judgment to make, but that's the real choice we face. That's the realist. That's the real bit in my sense of realism.
What an extraordinary privilege and gift Colin Steele keeps enabling us to participate in these conversations between extraordinary intellectuals who think long and hard about really, really difficult questions, and encourage us to challenge ourselves and our own preconceptions. Thank you both for a very illuminating, if not to say somewhat confronting conversation. One of the things that I, as Dean of the College of Asia of the Pacific, very used to is men of a certain age being realists about things and leaving me profoundly depressed, but profoundly depressed and with an urge to understand more and understand better. And Hugh, Allan has taken us through much of your work. One of the things that really struck me, as somebody who grew up in that, what now appears to be anomalous period, when we thought that peace was possible forever for those of us that lived in the West. And you talk about, and you're talking about politicians and leaders, but I think I am of a generation of people who, as you say, made their careers in the comfortable world that we used to know and do not want to take responsibility for the tougher world ahead. And I think if we take that seriously, and we should, it seems to me that one of the consequences of feeling that that comfortable world was going to be forever was that we became careless, and that we became too casual. And we became careless about a range of things, including, and I have to say this as the Dean of the College of Asia and the Pacific, including having any real understanding of the region in which we are a part. But above and beyond that, we became careless about our own institutions, and we became careless about the people that we forgot about because they didn't share our views and they didn't share in the prosperity that we enjoyed. And those communities and those people have become incredibly fertile ground for people like President Trump, because he appeals to their sense of being spoken to and being part of something that they feel they were not part of. So I think one of the things that in the essay, but also in the conversation that you and Allan have just had, it's a strong reminder to us that we cannot afford to be casual and careless about the circumstances in which we have been privileged to live much of our lives. And I think that matters because I think coming to this question of the multipolar world, which we've talked about in and around international relations for a while, but you're forcing us, Hugh, to think seriously about that. I think the next question, the question is not now, is it going to be a multipolar world? The question is going to be, how do we deal with the demands of that multipolar world? And what is that going to demand from us? And it will demand a great deal. not just in terms of, as Allan keeps urging us, to really understand our place in this region and to understand the region and the various countries and their histories and their cultures and their languages. We need to know much more about that, but we also need to recognize that the world that Hugh describes, and IR people do this, they talk about the great powers and they talk about Russia and China and the US, but we also need to remember that the context have changed. Diasporas are now huge communities in these countries. There is a vast difference in the diversity of populations, which has, generated its own kind of feeding frenzy for populists. But it has meant that the conversations need to be more nuanced, more respectful, and harder. And so multipolarity has demands of its own, but multipolarity in a world where we are very diverse, whether we like it or not, has additional demands. And you talked about moral suasion, you talk about economic power, soft power. There are all of these threads that run in different ways that we need to be conscious of. And of course, the other thing that we don't really have any sense of how it's going to upend all of this is what happens with generative AI. What happens when we don't need Hugh? Goodness me. But seriously, what happens, and it happens now if you go onto the web, you don't need to read everything Hugh's ever written or Allan has ever written. You just ask ChatGPT, what do I need to know about this? And it'll tell you something, and it'll mostly be wrong, but it will give you a sense that you have mastery of a topic without having to have done the hard yards, learned the language, lived in the place, studied the policy documents, been part of the process. So we need, again, to think about multipolarity in a world where generative AI is part and parcel of that process. And that brings us to questions of leadership. And you talked a little bit about agency and about who gets to make choices. One of the other things we know about leadership, and Allan started with this in the context of Hugh's discussion of President Trump's rise to power, the extraordinary way in which we all think that we will stand up to power, and then we discover that we don't. Then we discover that it's actually very easy for leaders who are determined and mercurial to be able to get their own way, either because people are too naive to understand what is happening, or because they believe that if they keep their heads down, everything will be all right for them, or because they're simply not capable of finding a response. And we need to do better. And the last thing I would want to say before inviting you all to join me in congratulating Hugh and Allan for an extraordinary conversation is when it comes to the question of what happened with nuclear power and the progress we made, whether you think of it as a moral question or a realist question, for me, what comes out of this conversation is the fact that we constantly need to endeavour. We cannot afford to simply say we have dealt with that question, it is not an issue for us any longer. It is about patience, it is about diligence, and it is about taking the time to understand what is happening. And with guides like Hugh and Allan, we will always be provoked, and we will always be educated, and indeed we will always be entertained. So please join me in thanking them both.